she felt a stirring deep within her, a faint glimmer of hope, perhaps defiance. She could not resign herself to this fate, not yet. There had to be a way to break the curse, to end the cycle of suffering that bound her and the others to this place. Driven by this newfound determination, Eliza began to search the palace with renewed vigor. She scoured the libraries, reading through ancient tomes and scrolls in search of a forgotten spell or ritual that might release her from the curse. She studied the tapestries and carvings, seeking hidden symbols or clues that could point her toward a solution. But the more she searched, the more elusive the answers became. It was as if the palace itself was working against her, keeping its secrets hidden and shrouded in darkness. The whispers of the dead grew louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to warn her, or perhaps to dissuade her from continuing her quest. One night, as Eliza sat in the grand hall, poring over a crumbling manuscript by the light of a flickering candle, she heard a soft voice behind her. "You will not find what you seek." Eliza turned sharply, her heart pounding. Standing in the doorway was a woman dressed in the flowing robes of a queen, her long hair cascading over her shoulders like a veil of shadows. Her eyes were dark, filled with a sadness that seemed to stretch across centuries. "Who are you?" Eliza asked, though she already knew the answer. The woman stepped forward, her movements graceful yet ethereal, as if she were not fully anchored to this world. "I was once the queen of this court," she said softly, "the wife of the Phantom Prince." Eliza felt a chill run down her spine. The stories she had read spoke of the queen's tragic fate, how she had been poisoned by the same conspirators who had betrayed the prince, how her spirit had been cursed to wander the palace, forever mourning the loss of her husband and her kingdom. "Is there no way to break the curse?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The queen shook her head sadly. "The curse was born of hatred and betrayal, and it can only be broken by the same hands that created it. But those hands are long gone, and their sins have bound us all to this place." Eliza's hope began to wane, but the queen stepped closer, her eyes locking onto Eliza's with an intensity that made her breath catch. "However," Queen continued, "there may be another way. The curse is tied to the royal bloodline, to the sins of our ancestors. If you could find a way to cleanse the bloodline, to atone for the wrongs that were committed, you might be able to free us all." Eliza felt a spark of hope rekindle within her. "How can I do that?" she asked, eager for any chance to escape her fate. The queen's gaze softened, and for a moment, Eliza thought she saw a flicker of warmth in her eyes. "You must find the last living descendant of the royal bloodline," she said. "They hold the key to our salvation. Only through their act of penance can the curse be lifted." Eliza's mind raced. She had never heard of any surviving members of the royal family, but if the queen was right, then there was still a chance to break the curse. But where would she find such a person? And how would she convince them to atone for sins committed so long ago? As if reading her thoughts, Queen placed a gentle hand on Eliza's shoulder. "The bloodline still exists," he said, her voice barely a whisper. "But they are hidden, unaware of their heritage. You must find them, and you must help them understand the weight of their ancestors' sins." Before Eliza could ask anything more, the queen began to fade, her form dissolving into the shadows. "Hurry," she whispered, her voice echoing through the grand hall. "Time is running out." Eliza was left alone in the darkness, her mind whirling with the queen's words. She knew what she had to do, but the task ahead seemed impossible. Still, it was her only hope, and she could not afford to waste any more time. With renewed determination, Eliza set out to find the last descendant of the royal bloodline. She left the palace for the first time since her entrapment, venturing into the world beyond its cursed walls. Forest seemed less foreboding now, as if it too wished to see the curse lifted. Her search led her across the kingdom, from bustling cities to remote villages, following faint whispers of rumors and legends. She spoke to scholars, historians, and anyone who might have knowledge of the royal family's hidden lineage. But for every lead she uncovered, she found more dead ends, more questions without answers. As weeks turned into months, Eliza began to lose hope. The curse weighed heavily on her, sapping her strength and will. But just when she was about to give up, she found a clue. A name, scrawled in the margins of an ancient text. It was a name that had been erased from history, forgotten by all except those who sought to hide it. The name led her to a small, isolated village at the edge of the kingdom, far from the reach of the palace's influence. There she found a young man named Thomas, who lived a simple life as a blacksmith. He was strong and kind, with no knowledge of his royal heritage. But when Eliza looked into his eyes, she saw the same haunted sadness that had marked the prince in the portrait. Thomas was skeptical of Eliza's story, but she persisted, showing him the evidence she had gathered, the records of his ancestry that had been buried for so long. Slowly, the truth began to dawn on him. The weight of his bloodline, the sins of his forefathers, and the curse that had plagued them for generations. "I never asked for this," Thomas said one night, as they sat by a dying fire in his humble home. "I don't want to be a part of this curse. I don't want to be responsible for the suffering of so many." Eliza understood his reluctance. She too had been drawn into a fate she hadn't chosen, but she also knew that Thomas was their only hope. "You may not want this," she said gently, "but you have the power to end it. The curse can only be broken by an act of true penance, by someone who acknowledges the sins of the past and seeks to make amends." Thomas stared into the flames, his expression torn. "What must I do?" he asked after a long silence. "The palace awaits," Eliza replied. "You must return with me, face the spirits of your ancestors, and offer yourself as a sacrifice to atone for their wrongs." The journey back to the royal court was long and arduous. Thomas did not waver. He was determined to end the curse, not just for the sake of the dead, for the living as well. When they arrived at the palace gates, Eliza could feel the tension in the air, as if the very stones of the palace were holding their breath. The phantom prince appeared before them as they entered the throne room, his form more solid now, more real. The spirits of the court gathered around them, their eyes fixed on Thomas. "Do you understand what you must do?" the prince asked, his voice filled with a terrible sorrow. Thomas nodded, his expression resolute. "I am ready." With Eliza at his side, Thomas approached the throne. He knelt before it, his head bowed, and began to speak. He confessed the sins of his ancestors, the betrayals, the murders, the greed that had led to the curse. He offered himself as a penance, as a final sacrifice to cleanse the bloodline. As he spoke, the air in the room began to change. The oppressive weight that had hung over the palace for centuries began to lift, and the spirits around them seemed to glow with a soft, ethereal light. The phantom prince's form wavered, and for the first time, Thomas looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. "Is it really over?" Eliza nodded, smiling through her own tears. "Yes, the curse is broken." Together, they rose and left the palace, the gates closing behind them with a finality that marked the end of an era. The royal court of Ravenwood was silent once more, but it was a silence of peace, not of despair. As they walked away from the palace, Eliza knew that the story of the phantom of the royal court had come to an end, but she also knew that the memory of the prince, the queen, and all those who had suffered would live on, a reminder of the power of forgiveness and the strength of the human spirit. And in the end, that was the true legacy of the royal court. A legacy not of power or wealth, but of redemption,